Hello everybody, welcome to my video assignment for EDSE 307. My goal is to show you something that I feel is extremely important and especially relevant right here in Canada, and I hope that in the next 5 minutes I can make you as excited over this as I am. So now, in order to introduce my topic to you, we have to start at the beginning. Whoa, too far. See, now this is Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, but that is another story for another time. Come on back. There we go, that's better. Our topic today is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Something unique and inherently Canadian. It is probably the most important legal document in Canadian history. But our story doesn't start here. It actually starts with the 1960 Federal Bill of Rights. And actually, let's just go back a little bit before that. See, the world had just gone through a great war, the first one. And then after a lot of things happened in between, we got a second world war. But now that that was over, people had to get to work to fix all of the things that had happened during these wars. And one thing that was brought up around the world was human rights. People had seen Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Russia, and they had seen just how many atrocities can happen if people's basic human rights aren't protected. Somebody needed to act, and in 1948 the newly formed United Nations wrote up a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But let's go back to Canada for a minute. In 1947, Tommy Douglas, then Premier of Saskatchewan, wrote up a provincial human rights document he called the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights. It was the first of its kind in Canada, and it really inspired some people. One of these people was John Diefenbaker. I mean Baker, another story, another time. Diefenbaker had been calling for some protection to human rights since 1945 as a member of Parliament, and this only intensified as time went on. While Canada was a strong supporter of human rights on an international level, we had not always had the best track record at home. During times of war, Canada had implemented what is known as the War Measures Act. It gave the federal government sweeping powers, which included imprisoning people without charges, censoring people, and dispossessing people of their homes and property. This led to the internment of nearly 40,000 Canadian citizens during the two world wars because they were perceived as allies of the enemy. Remember to go back to John Diefenbaker, because Mr. Diefenbaker was a man of action, and so he slowly worked his way up the ranks from Member of Parliament to opposition leader. And in the 1957 election, he won an upset victory over Louis St. Laurent's Liberal Party and became the Prime Minister of Canada. 2 short years later, he pushed through the Federal Bill of Rights, which protected, among other things, the freedoms of the press, religion, speech, as well as the rights to life, liberty, security, and equality. This was the first federal legislation of its kind in Canada, and it was an incredible win for human rights advocates. But there were some issues with the Bill of Rights. Well, what issues, you might ask? Well, that's a good question. It was a federal document, so it didn't apply to provincial courts. Judges didn't always agree with how to interpret it. The War Measures Act still superseded this bill, which meant that rights weren't always protected, and it wasn't permanent. Being just a regular bill meant it could be amended, or other legislation could be brought in to replace it pretty easily, and that meant that it didn't really serve its purpose of always protecting people's rights. So now what do? This was still the best human rights legislation in Canada, but it wasn't very useful, and it quickly became apparent that the flaws outweighed the good parts. So how do we solve this problem? Do we get new bills? Do we change this one? Nobody really knew the answer. Until Trudeau. Guys, no. Not that one. Think older, less hair. Yeah, that one! Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first one, was the Prime Minister from 1968 until 1984. He lost one election in 1979, and when he came back, he realized this would be his last chance in office, and he worked to finish everything he had wanted to do for years. One of these objectives, of course, was to pirouette behind the Queen. Another, possibly even more important idea, was the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was significantly more in-depth than the Bill of Rights. It included in-depth areas for fundamental freedoms, including those of expression, association, and religion, legal, democratic, equality, and mobility rights, the official languages of Canada, and also protection of multiculturalism and Aboriginal rights. So now, let's remember all of the problems we had with the Bill of Rights. Trudeau sat down and thought about it and found a solution to each one of these problems. First of all, the premiers of every single province, except, of course, Quebec, and, well, that's another story for another time, were a part of negotiations in the Charter, and this extended the powers to not only the federal government, but also to provincial and territorial jurisdictions as well. Secondly, the Charter itself includes instructions on how it should be interpreted to help keep it as consistent as possible across different jurisdictions. The third problem was not really fixed in the Charter itself, but in 1988, the War Measures Act was repealed and replaced with the Emergencies Act, which is itself tied to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So now, even in times of crisis, the government is not allowed to violate the Charter. And fourthly, Trudeau ensured the stability of human rights by including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms within the Canadian Constitution in 1982. To change the Constitution, you need to have an extremely strenuous process, including 50% of the Canadian population, at least 7 of the provinces, or for some extremely important ideas, unanimous approval across every single provincial government, the Senate, and the House of Commons. And so it is extremely difficult to change any part of the Constitution. So is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms perfect? Absolutely not. For one thing, there's some water damage, and there's this big ugly red stain on it. But logistically, Aboriginal rights are still a concern. How well do courts use it to protect Canadians? Has it made it harder to convict felons? How feasible is it to take the government to the courts to argue for your rights? And does the Charter replace individual responsibility with individual rights? All of these are valid concerns and honest questions, and there are no easy answers. Even the simple answers are sometimes hard to hear because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not perfect and there are challenges. At the same time, of course, the Charter is an incredible milestone in human rights in Canada, and so far it has worked better than the Bill of Rights, and it has worked better than any other legislation in Canada. But there is still room for improvement, and we're going to get to that too. It's another story for another time. Thank you for listening.
Created using Powtoon.